more than 91,000 classified military records relating to the war in Afghanistan. Julian Assange talks to reporters about the release of the documents spanning 6 years. He also discusses unreported incidents of Afghan civilian killings and covert operations against the Taliban contained in the reports.
The Guardian from this morning, 14 pages about this topic. Also concurrently in the Spiegel, 17 pages. The New York Times, I'm not sure how many, International Herald Tribune, and I believe the Telegraph also has it on front page. I haven't checked into the others.
What do you say when people like the White House accuse you of compromising the security of troops in Afghanistan by virtue of this massive leak?
Yeah. We're familiar with groups whose abuse we expose, attempting to criticize the messenger, to distract from the power of the message. And we don't see any difference in the White House's response to this case to the other groups that we have exposed. We have tried hard to make sure that this material does not put innocents at harm. All the material is over 7 months old, so is of no current operational consequence, even though it may be of very significant investigative consequence.
Julian, to the Senator for the Associated Press, I'm curious as to whether you feel at risk at all or under threat, either here in the UK or elsewhere, as a result of this or another.
Yeah. From time to time, we have threat warnings from our sources and people in a position to know in government and some national security reporters. We take those seriously. In the West, we haven't felt a threat to our personal safety. In Kenya and other parts of the developing world, unfortunately, that has not always been true. We do have surveillance events from time to time, and there have been more in the past few months. We understand from the work of a national security reporter in Australia that the Australian government was asked by the United States to engage in certain forms of surveillance of my person and other WikiLeaks people in Australia. That source says most of those requests were rejected by the Australian government.
What do you think this does to the stated aim of the UK, US and other NATO allies that they want to leave the country? Do you think it helps or hinders the eventual drawdown of British troops in American?
I think it's too early to say yet. It's clear that it will shape an understanding of what the past 6 years of war has been like, and that the course of the war needs to change. The manner in which it needs to change is not yet clear.
There are a number of issues that have obviously come up through these leaks, but what do you think has been the most damning revelation?
I'm often asked this question. What is the most single damning revelation? What is the thing that is easily capturable? The single event, the single personality, the single mass killing. But that is not the real story of this material. The real story of this material is that it's war. It's one damn thing after another. It is the continuous small events, the continuous deaths of children, insurgents, allied forces, the maimed people. Search for the word amputation in this material, or amputee, and there are dozens and dozens of references. So this is the story of the war since 2004. And like most of the accidents that occur on the road are as a result of cars, not of buses. most of the deaths in this war are as a result of the everyday squalor of war, not the big incidences. That said, of course, there are reports with high kill counts in this material. For example, a single report taking place on August the 9th, 2006 has a kill count of 181. One wounded, 0 detained. What is the circumstance behind that report? Well, it's part of Operation Medusa, but the full circumstance is not yet known. According to the report, an AC-130 gunship, there's a cargo plane which has been fitted out with cannons all along one side, circled around for 3 hours and killed 62 of those people. If we add up all the deaths in that report, we get about 80. The deaths of the other 100 are still unexplained. There are many reports like that. They look very suspicious, but the full details are not yet explained. We can see the behavior of Task Force 373, a Special Forces assassination squad, a kill or capture squad, involved in pursuing the JPEL, the Joint Priority Effects List, a euphemism for the US assassination list, kill or capture list in Afghanistan. There are many events associated with that, some that resulted in the deaths of, one that resulted in the deaths of 7 children, and others that resulted in the deaths of a number of other innocents. For that list, we can also see how people get on the list. They seem to be recommended by regional governors in Afghanistan or by intelligence authorities, often with, it appears, little evidence and, of course, no judicial review.
Can you say how you came to cooperate with the New York Times, Guardian, and the Spiegel?
So, I mean, that's quite an interesting journalistic story that we managed to pull together these 4 groups, Sunshine Press, WikiLeaks, the Spiegel, New York Times, and the Guardian, to share investigative resources. We shared research stemming out of this material, not final stories, but research and computational techniques to deal with this material as equal partners, with the exception that we controlled the embargo date and could move that back and forth. I spoke to Nick Davies of The Guardian, who was instrumental in starting to broker that arrangement, and then we did it at an editor-editor basis between the Alan Rusbriger and the editor of Der Spiegel and the editor of the New York Times.
I'll ask you a very quick question. The MOD this morning are saying that even they aren't able to verify much of these documents. I'm sure the US would probably say the same about other documents too at this stage. How can you be sure that what's placed up on the internet is accurate? And if some of it is not, doesn't that eat into your legitimacy, WikiLeaks, because it's wrong information and therefore it's up there?
If some of that information was inaccurate, that would eat into our legitimacy, quite correct. However, we have never released misdescribed material, and I don't expect this case to be any exception.
Some people are suggesting that lots of the intelligence, or some of the intelligence, it's difficult to quantify, came from low level, came from people who are biased against different groups.
Absolutely.
And so how can you rely on that? How can you allow people to read information and it placed up there as if it were truths, as far as you're concerned?
When we publish material, what we say is the document as we describe it is true. We publish CIA reports all the time that are legitimate CIA reports. That doesn't mean the CIA is telling the truth. Similarly, with this material, there is reporting from military units of various kinds in Afghanistan, reporting from US embassies across the world about matters relevant to Afghanistan, reporting from informers in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Those are legitimate reports. It doesn't mean that the contents are true.
So people should exercise caution.
People should exercise caution, and I'll give you some examples of the ways in which they should exercise caution. And we, in fact, do this. If you go to wardiary.wikileaks.org, you will see how to read the material report. You will find that US military units, when self-reporting, of course, often speak in exculpatory language, redefine civilian casualties as insurgent casualties, downplay the number of casualties. And we know this by comparing these reports to the public record for where there has been comprehensive investigations. So as an example, Kunduz, Gorani. For the Kunduz report, we see that the initial report from the field was 56 insurgents killed, no civilians killed, but we know from later reportage investigation, in fact, most of the people killed were civilians, and there was some 100 and something. But when military units report on other military units, they are more likely to be frank. On other US military units. When they report on other allied units that are not from the US military, for example on the Poles or on the Brits, they are even more likely to tell the truth. And of course, when they are reporting on the Taliban, then all the evil comes out. Similarly, when we look at reporting from informers, we can see sometimes completely outlandish claims. They just don't hold water. It will sometimes say that that reporting is a result of the source being paid. It will sometimes, there is a rating system that Marines intelligence will give these sources, how reliable they think they are. So that is the opinion of Marines intelligence as to Marines G2 intelligence, how reliable the source is and how much you should take away from it. But just like dealing with any source, you should exercise some common sense. That doesn't mean you should close your eyes.
Julian, what have you learned about the Germans?
Julian from ITV News. One of the statements the White House made immediately with regard to the Pakistani links, the guidance was, the opening sentence says, "I don't think anyone who follows this issue will find it surprising." And I suppose that's what I found about this whole thing, that the detail is stunning in the 91,000 documents or something. And yet, in the end, there is so much that one doesn't find entirely surprising. I wonder if you've concluded that at the end of all this. And following on from my colleague about reliability, do you find it in any way suspicious that the documents that you've got here are all labelled secret but not top secret? They're all fairly low-level field reports. They come from junior officers. The only guy in jail is a private first class. I mean, have you any feeling that perhaps you have reason to doubt the reliability of these documents?
We have no reason to doubt the reliability of these documents. We should say what they don't include. They don't include top secret reports. They don't include most reports from US Special Forces. They don't include reports by the CIA. They don't include reports by other coalition partners. However, they do include the majority of regular US Army activity. And where regular US Army overlaps in the activities of other forces in Afghanistan, it includes reports about their activities. So when Task Force 373, the Special Forces Assassination Squad, is involved in a raid, it will often partner with regular US Army forces, and so there are descriptions about its activities. Similarly, when the CIA is engaged in a raid, or US Army bomb squad needs to be called in, or something like this, you'll see OGA, other government agency, a sort of cover, typically for the CIA, sometimes for the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency. And you can see some information about the behavior of the CIA through this overlap with regular US Army activity.
And the aspect of being surprised by the revelations. Should any of us be surprised after
I'll go on to this one.
In what circumstances would you public measure, or are there any?
We have a harm minimization process. Our goal is just reform. Our method is transparency, but we do not put the method before the goal. We have a serious endeavor. We do things in policy. We do not do things in an ad hoc way. So far, our harm minimization procedures have always worked. To our knowledge, no one has ever been physically harmed by the material we have released, even though we have caused the change of governments and many other serious reforms.
Just a quick follow-up. Would you accept
Sorry.
The material that you've released applies to the period when the policy of so-called cautious restraint was in place. That policy is now been lifted by US forces. Do you expect there to be a similar revelation in the future, that the rate of Afghan civilian deaths would be greater than those you revealed in these documents?
I don't know enough about that policy to comment meaningfully. I can only say prima facie, if restraints are reduced, there will be more civilian casualties.
BBC, you talk about the harm minimisation policies, and this is only relates to the material before 7 months ago. But how do you respond to the charge that you're in no position to know, particularly given the vast amount of material out there, what harm is being done to sources or potential sources in terms of that? And also on the historical point about it all relating from last year, how do you respond to the point
One question.
Well, how do you respond to the point that the Obama administration would argue that actually you say things must change, that they will argue that things have changed, that this all comes before the surge actually got into operation?
One of the interesting things that we have noticed from this material is that at the time that McChrystal took command, with a stated policy intention of reducing civilian casualties, especially from airstrikes, a new field appeared in these reports. A field of credible allegations of coalition forces causing civilian casualties. That appears to have been an attempt by McChrystal to get some handle on the situation, to get some measure on where civilian casualties were occurring as a result of coalition activity. But what we see is that the US Army is an enormous boat that is extremely hard to turn around, and the cover-up of those sorts of crimes begins at the bottom and moves its way to the top. So it is quite hard to enact a new policy and have it filtered down to a change in practice. A new policy by Obama does not mean a change of practice by the US military any more than a new policy by McChrystal meant a change in practice by US forces.
So these are war crimes. Well, you said cover up.
You already asked the question. Sorry.
Yeah, but it's an important.
Julian, BBC Radio. Have you and have your partners published all the information that you gave them access to? If they held back, what did they hold back on? And do you have more of this kind of material to come out? We've spoken about the video, which was
WikiLeaks since December has been on a bit of a publishing hiatus in order to do significant re-engineering to cope with the level of submissions we were receiving and the level of public interest in our site. It's actually a very hard engineering task to supply 2 to 5% of the entire world internet-connected population at a single moment with material. And so we're a small organisation trying to understand how to do that and do that in a secure way. As a result, we have built up during that period an enormous backlog of whistleblower disclosures. Additionally, after the collateral murder tape came out, which revealed how 2 Reuters journalists were killed in 2007 in Baghdad, along with 18 to 26 other people, we received a substantial increase in the number of submissions. So now we have an enormous range of material we are trying to get through and trying to keep our promise to our sources in achieving the maximum political impact for that material.
But in relation to these in particular, these documents, have you released all of them?
This is one of those cases. This is one of the cases of us getting through our backlog. So we have released to the public some 76,000 reports from this set of material. The set itself comprises of over 91,000 reports. We have held back about 15,000 reports of a particular type to undergo a further harm minimisation review. And those some of those reports will be redacted and released as soon as we are able to get through them, and others will be withheld until the security situation in Afghanistan means that it is safe to release them. And by safe, I do not mean safe for military forces, I mean safe for the local population of Afghanistan.
Why did you call some of these questions, these actions crimes just now, and then decline to answer the question from my colleague as to what you meant by that?
I don't find that interesting.
Well, hang on, you're here to talk about the freedom of expression, and you're refusing to answer questions when they get difficult. That's a little hypocritical.
No, you have your phrase, your question.
You used the word crimes, and now you're refusing to explain why. Tell us why.
You have to wait your turn, and you also have to phrase your questions in a meaningful way.
You used the word crimes, not me.
Do we have another question?
Do you find that difficult?
Just curious as to why you decided to limit your form of collaboration with the liberal media outlets, and as a new media platform, why specifically focus on print?
Well, I am a print journalist. I mean, we've had one video production so far, so we don't really know how to do TV that well. We had hoped to partner with a network to do a more significant investigation, but limited time and resources eclipse that. We do hope to do that next time. The reason why these 3 organisations, obviously we can't have a journalistic coalition which is too large, sharing everything equally. For the logistical reasons, it just doesn't hold. So when we're talking 3 or 4, that we can actually get together into a room and agree on all the conditions. Those simply are, with possibly the exception of some French publications, the best 3 research publications in print: New York Times, The Spiegel, and The Guardian.
One of them is a German one. I just wonder, you mentioned the good news report earlier on as well. How do you see the role of the German troops? What do you think will be the reaction?
The investigation of the Kunduz event in 2005, which killed over 100 people and approximately 60 to 80 civilians, by the German press, is an interesting case study, because the German press investigated this with incredible thoroughness that is not seen for any other single event in Afghanistan or Iraq. and it's really, I suppose, a credit to the German press to see that level of investigation. But it also speaks to some kind of market demand or cultural desire in Germany to see those sort of crimes thoroughly investigated where German forces play a part. There are a number of reports that do concern German forces and the regions where German forces are stationed, including Task Force 373, which is stationed or has been stationed near a German-controlled region. Der Spiegel has more on that issue. I will let them speak for me. They know more about the details.
Did you experience any approaches or attempts to block publication from the US government, and how were they aware of what's happening?
It's just referring generally to these actions as crimes. It's just too good.
Obviously,
we expression on his
are not in a position to say
as soon as it gets difficult, you won't answer questions.
What the United States government as a whole is aware of will not simply be impossible. But the New York, the media groups, including us, agreed that the New York Times would approach the White House for comment and the Pentagon for comment, and that comment would then come back and be shared amongst the others. That approach took place in the middle of last week. So they knew it at least since that point. We haven't had any direct attempts to censor us. Like every delicate investigation, we have, of course, held things close to our chest, and so have the other media organisations.
What, if anything, do you hope to change with the release of this report? Change the foreign policy, more information, a higher public profile, yourself, the site?
We give a promise to whistleblowers that come to us, that is our role as the International Public Service, that provided they meet some very simple criteria, like a lawyer, we will represent them fairly to the court, in our case, the court of public opinion. So this submission met that criteria, and therefore we were tasked to keep our promise of getting the maximum political impact for it. And I think we appear to be living up to that promise. That said, of course, some material calls out for more attention, and material which exposes significant human rights abuses tasks us to spend more effort on it.
Some of those will be 15,000 documents I think you were talking about earlier on. So presumably within those 15,000 or so documents there are things that you maybe have already seen that might deserve some amount of attention. Being the case, and the fact that you get media coverage whenever these things happen, can you then therefore answer the question that's been asked twice already by a journalist? You mentioned the word crimes. Can you please just be a bit more specific about what you meant by are these crimes committed within these documents? Because unless the question's answered, how do you expect the media to take you seriously down the line when there are potentially more good stories to come out?
What is your specific question?
You mentioned a while ago war crimes or crimes when you were talking about the documents. You weren't specific. What I'm asking you is to be more specific when you talk about war crimes, or crimes is I think the word you used.
I think I was speaking about the issue in general. However, it is up to a court to decide clearly whether something is in the end a crime. That said, prima facie, there does appear to be evidence of war crimes in this material. An example is the Task Force 373 HIMARS missile strike on a house which killed 7 children.
Yeah, third time lucky.
Well, on the one hand, as we all know, the United Kingdom is a surveillance state. On the other hand, we do have extensive political, journalistic and community support in this country, and it would only serve our interests, in fact, to be, well, for me to be arrested or detained. I can't imagine that happening in this country, unless there was a miscommunication from the bureaucracy to the political leadership. The political leadership in this country would not tolerate that.
The motives of WikiLeaks in all of this are well known, and you've expressed them. I wondered, without revealing your source on this, what your source's motives for releasing this material to you were. Was a motive expressed to you for the release?
Yeah, when we get submissions, we typically get a statement. In fact, we require usually a statement from the source about what they want us to do with the material, why it's important, and so on. So yes, the source wanted to call attention to a number of these incidents. Not all the ones that we have found, but some of the ones that we have found, and their perception was, of course, there would be many more, and they appear to be correct.
Will WikiLeaks be helping out with Bradley Manning?
Yes, we have committed funds to Mr. Manning's lawyer. We are his JAG team, and they understand that those funds are available at the point that he wishes to choose to engage his civilian counsel. Presently, his JAG, US military legal team, has not chosen civilian counsel.
Probably to be independent. The 15,000 documents you talked about, are they similar low level, the ones that you're looking at further, are they similar low level intelligence reports, or does this include US embassy cables and other documents?
There are over 50 US embassy cables in the material that has been released already. The majority of the material that has not been released yet are threat reports.
You said earlier on you weren't directly blocked to publish material. Could you give us examples of not directly blocked means?
We experience certain, surveillance events from time to time, and our sources have told us something of the decision-making process that was occurring some months ago within the White House. I shouldn't really say more about that, but that the private statements are made within the White House and State Department were concerning. However, those private statements have now synced up to the public statements, which are acceptable, mostly acceptable. Yes.
One of the papers you work with suggested that you have access to several million files, which amount to an untold history of American government activity around the world, and that they'd be very controversial. Can you confirm that, and can you give us some flavour of why they're so controversial?
We have, in this backlog that we have built up, we have files that concern every country in the world with a population of over 1 million people, including the United States. We won't go into further detail until that material is to be released. That it is not one thing about lots of places, but rather thousands of databases and files about all sorts of countries.
When do you hope to clear this backlog?
We're working as hard as we can.
Have you got a big team?
We have a small team of dedicated and overworked people. That said, we also have around 800 volunteers, part-time volunteers, and an extended network of 10,000 people and I suppose loosely 70,000 supporters. But as anyone who will know who's managed an organisation, going from a small organisation to a large organisation is very difficult, let alone in this adversarial security environment that we have to work in.
Easy was it for your source to use info and press along? What did he actually do?
No comment.
Can you say whether it's easy or hard? Is it something you expect to happen more often in the future? Or?
Are you getting a sense that now that this is, appears to be quite sort of big and it's getting a lot of coverage, that more people are going to follow suit and come forward with information? Are you already getting a sense that people are approaching you with stuff?
That is our experience, that courage is contagious, that when there is a significant source disclosure that is resulting in a media impact and appears that it's going to result in some kind of political reform down the track, sources are encouraged by the opportunities that they see before them and step forward. So we expect that to also be true in this case.
So the age of the whistleblower.
Entering into it.
Hope so. Hope so.
Are we concerned at any point about the effect this might have on the ongoing investigation into the charges against the ex-Iranians?
Yes. Yes, we were. Mr. Manning there is no allegation, as far as we can determine, that this material is connected to Bradley Manning, either in the sort of chat logs and evidence that has been provided, or as a result of the charges that the US military have applied to him. But that said, he is a very high-profile alleged source. In fact, he's the only alleged US military source. So there is, of course, a natural media tendency for anything related to US government or US military to try and correlate this to Mr. Manning. But as far as we can see from the public record, there is no evidence of a correlation.
If I understood you right earlier on, you said you think you got more correct details if the troops reported about others than themselves.
Yes.
Did you come across any differences for the German side, the way they reported?
There are no reports in here directly from German forces. There are some reports by US forces saying what German forces have told them, and there are reports by US forces on their interactions or encounters with German forces and others. But there are no direct reports in this material from any other group than the United States Army and Marines. Sometimes there are reports that are given to regular Army and Marines and that are then incorporated into this material. For example, US Embassy cables.
Could you compare that which was made publicly knowledge to the German public in general, and have a comparison there to internal files?
I'm not across.
How do you feel about the Taliban or Al-Qaeda using your material for their own publicity, their own propaganda?
That's possible. But where publicity is based on the truth, we do not now call that propaganda. We did in the 1930s, but not anymore. That said, this material does not leave anyone smelling like roses, especially the Taliban. I mean, there are some reports in here, if you add up the figures, of 2,000 people, civilians killed by IEDs. Now, of course, it is wrong to say that all those IEDs were planted by the Taliban. but they were presumably planted by rebel forces of some description in Afghanistan.
What do you think in the end the disclosure of these documents really signifies? I mean, I think you've said that this is the most comprehensive history of a war in terms of the raw detail ever to have been printed. But
yes.
What do you think that signifies? What does it mean in the end? What will change? What might change? What should change?
So, this is the equivalent of opening the Stasi archives. No one particular Stasi file has a tremendous impact to change a whole nation, to change the whole nation of Germany. But across all the Stasi files, many individuals are represented, and many people in German society could see their connection to the behaviour of the Stasi. And that's something that came out over time. So I expect that to be the case also in this material. It is a history. It is an enormous compendium of material that will affect many different people in different ways. We, as a journalistic group, the 4 media groups who worked on this, have really only just scratched the surface. I think between us we've probably read about 1,000 or 2,000 of these reports properly. So it's going to take the rest of the world press and academics to look at the statistics that come out of this, and the soldiers and returned soldiers from Afghanistan, from coalition forces. It will take the Taliban to look at this. The refugees from Afghanistan, the locals still living there, to all look at this and say, I understand that event, I was there. This is just a tiny summary. Let me tell you what really went on. That was my father who was killed. That was my buddy who was killed. That was my commanding officer who gave me an order that I was extremely uncomfortable with. We saw things like that coming out when we released the collateral murder video. We saw two US soldiers involved in that event come forward and give many additional details. We saw the sons and brothers of the journalists who were killed in that event come forward and give details. We saw the wife of the driver who was killed in the van come forward and give additional details. So that's what I expect to happen with this material. And to some degree, it is of such scope that it eclipses the economic ability of the press to go through it. It's going to require not just the press, but all interested parties to understand this material. And that is why we have endeavoured to put it into a format that is easy for people to go through and comprehend.
Sorry, can I just follow up? Just to understand you correctly, did you say that you have only gone through in detail 2,000 of these, whatever it is, 75,000, 91,000 documents? Well, how do you square that then with your argument that this is a responsible publication and that you've done all the harm minimisation that you said you had?
The documents are in many different categories. They are tagged with different categories. So we can see that some categories do not have the type of material that would, as an example, identify innocent informers.
Looking towards the future of WikiLeaks, what's your greatest fear?
Well, things are going pretty well so far. I mean, I suppose our greatest fear is that we will be too successful too fast, and we won't be able to do justice to the material we're getting in fast enough. That's our greatest problem at the moment.
Do you accept that secrecy is an important and necessary part of government?
Secrecy is sometimes perfectly legitimate. For example, your medical records with your doctor are probably, in all likelihood, perfectly entitled to confidentiality. But not always. There'll be some cases but that is not true.
So you make the choice then? You at WikiLeaks?
This is a matter about whether the coercive power of the state should be used to stop people sharing information who have no direct connection to the source of the information. So you can't use the coercive power of the state to stop people spreading rumours, to stop people discussing political life. And sophisticated US jurisprudence understands that. And that is why you have things like the First Amendment, which takes the press outside the legislative process, because in the end it is the communication of knowledge which regulates the legislature, which creates the Constitution. Yes?
Do you expect to be a major recipient of this sort of material in the future, or do you always see unrivaled whistleblowers like popping up that need to be watched and taken seriously?
Unfortunately, we do not see any rival whistleblower sites. We did have a grant application into the Knight Foundation to try and give our technology to every news organisation in the world. So every newspaper would have submit this material to us using WikiLeaks technology. But that grant application was rejected for political reasons after the collateral murder video.
Just to follow up, you mentioned 4 journalistic groups. 2 quick ones is, do you see yourself accountable in exactly the same way that 3 other media organisations have to be accountable? And secondly, given those media organisations focus on driving a profit, what is the commercial arrangement between yourselves as WikiLeaks and these 3 organisations who are advertised, etc.?
There was no commercial arrangement.
Ongoing in terms of the stability of the
No commercial arrangement at all. We have been blessed over the past few months of receiving extensive support by the public, not by foundations, support by journalists and by human rights activists. We have raised $1 million from the general public. As a result, we are enabled to have a sort of fierce independence that larger organizations find more difficult. That said, of course, we are also immediately accountable to the public, because that is where all our money comes from, directly from the public, not from advertisers and not from foundations.
Just clarify about what you want to happen now in terms of governments and prosecutors. What do you want to see done with the information that you've now posted? Now it's out there in the public domain. What do you expect to see happen, and what do you want to happen?
Well, we would like to see this material, the revelations that this material gives, be taken seriously, investigated by governments, and new policies put in place as a result, if not prosecutions of those people who have committed abuses. It's important to understand this material doesn't just reveal abuses. This material describes the past 6 years of war. Every major attack that resulted in someone being detained or someone being killed. That tells you how the war is going, where this happened, in what different parts of Afghanistan, what sort of weapon systems were used, which particular military units. Is there a killer unit in the United States military? Because there's been histories of that. You can find out using this data. You can create a simple computer program. We haven't done it yet, but any one of your technical staff can create a simple computer program to add up the kills by unit and find a top kill unit. So that's an example of something that can be immediately extracted from this. So you can really see how the war in Afghanistan is going, and then compare that to government statements and government policy. This is the raw material that ends up on the big boards on the war room. There's even a field in there, D color, which describes the color that this material ends up, and it's displayed on the big boards. This is the raw ingredients that lead to Pentagon statistics about civilian casualties, that lead to graphs about how many insurgents are killed. We only ever normally see those figures in aggregate, but now we have all the events that are used to create those figures, and we can understand whether those aggregate figures are in fact accurate or are they distortions. In fact, we can see in many cases where we know what's in this database and we have press sourcing or Afghan government investigation, we can see the disparity between these two. So we can see, in fact, the aggregate figures are based on faulty data.
Following what's combined with what you said earlier on, that it's a heavy ship difficult to turn around and it has to come from the bottom and from the top.
Yes.
Do you feel that the bottom is reporting in a way it's expected from them, or is it their opinion is so different from the top?
We see a lot of exculpatory language in these reports from a unit talking about why it killed someone. I mean, why convoy's going on a road, car comes along, goes to overtake, they shoot the driver. And so that unit then reports all the things that it did. And you see, we engaged in escalation of force procedure and we told him to stop and da-da-da-da-da. But then what you look is, if you look across these reports, you see an amazing number of civilians killed by ricochets. So we fired a warning shot and the ricochet ended up killing this person. I mean, it's just not credible that that many people can be killed by ricochets. So we see the, you know, it's like a policeman investigating himself, filing his own report about an alleged crime that he's meant to commit, alleged to have committed. Of course, that sort of reportage, internal reportage, is filled with errors. But it is those initial reports that then lead to investigations. So we can see the field credible allegations of coalition forces causing civilian injuries. That field that was introduced about the same time as General McChrystal took command. We see this unusually, applied to, in an unrepresentative way, non-US forces. So it's US forces talking about the Poles, it's US forces talking about the French, and that label gets applied. When a unit reports its own activities, that label never gets applied. Sometimes one US military unit will apply it to the activities of another US military unit. I mean, this shouldn't be any surprise if you have a basic understanding of how human beings behave. But it does show that it is a hard ship to manage, because the raw ingredients you need to manage it, the internal reporting, is not accurate. So what are you going to do?
So the top is relying on the information that might be stored anyway.
That's right. So there's distortions going up to the top, and then the top tries to push things down. We want you to report all the civilian kills. But of course, what incentive is there for a unit to report its own bad behaviour?
Do you know I was struck earlier on that that's what you said, you couldn't draw a central lesson from this huge amount of material. Even a small amount that I've read seems to tally with what you find when you're in Afghanistan, which is the primary catastrophic problem for the West is an utter lack of understanding of the Afghan people, where they are, who they are, what their motives are, what they're doing. A lot of what you've got here flows therefrom. Was it civilian casualties, for instance?
Okay.
Isn't that the central?
Well, I agree. But what's your question?
Do you draw the same central lesson?
The Afghan people are there's many diverse groups in Afghanistan having different economic basis, different language, different clan affiliations, and yet US troops and British troops are essentially culturally homogenous and all go in there with the same sort of culture, but there's many different regional cultures in Afghanistan. I mean, I feel that I would be drawing myself too much to agree with you, although I can see glimmers of that problem coming out of the material. But the one thing is very clear to me. I mean, it is one damn thing after another. It is war, but we don't normally see war. Through this material, we do see what war is like, at the everyday level, as well as the big events, the whole lot. You know, when we released this Iraq video, Gates, Secretary of Defense Gates, said that it was looking at war through a straw, and we only gave a 40-minute video, and somehow that this lacked context, although we did give news reports about what happened on the day. But this, if you like, is the beginning, the end, and the middle. This is the whole context, with some exceptions, of the Afghan war. And if anything can give us some kind of intellectual understanding, surely this is it. Whether it engages people emotionally is another matter. I mean, to some degree, that is the task of good journalism, is to turn this raw material, who, when, where, how many, into something that emotionally engages people who can apply levers on decision making.
Are you concerned though, I mean, accepting the argument, which I think is well made, and I think most of us here would respect that, but are you concerned that in the process of releasing this information that actually you're going to do more harm than good, at least in some areas? Talk about civilian casualties. What about the relationship between Pakistan and Afghanistan? It's a very volatile. A lot of the information about ISI involvement comes from MDS and apparently, you know, biased or potentially biased.
Yes.
You're releasing this onto the internet in a way that could, in fact, inflame at least an aspect. We talk about the Taliban, but there is another dimension, several other dimensions to the conflict. And are you concerned that this is, or have you thought about that? You know, this is going to make that situation worse.
There is no perfect information. But in the end, the truth is all we have, right?
But you have a moral ethical responsibility, we all do, to put information in a way that people can understand it and process it responsibly. I mean, there is...
Well, I think we have done that. I think we have done that extremely well. I mean, we have 14 pages in The Guardian just here. That's not a bad outcome, right, journalistically. I mean, what more could you do?
What about the security of the troops in Afghanistan when you publish this material?
The material is all 7 months old. There doesn't seem to be any, there's nothing about troop movements, no tactical considerations in this material. So why, of course, I am not, I would always think about that issue before dismissing it out of hand. We have looked at it and there doesn't seem to be anything significant. That said, I mean, the revelations of abuses by US and coalition forces may cause Afghanis to be upset, and rightly so. They should treat them better, not conceal abuses that have been undertaken.
Why does so much of this material that you publish come from US forces and not from other coalition partners such as the British?
Actually, we've published a lot of material from the British. In fact, the Ministry of Defence put in an order to British Telecom, which controls the gateway for MOD, and told them to block all connections going out to WikiLeaks in an attempt to stop British forces leaking us material. Or at least a stated attempt. Of course, what happened in practice is someone who was responsible for counterintelligence got some command from a more senior person saying, look at that thing on WikiLeaks, shouldn't you do something? And so they wrote a letter to British Telecom instructing British Telecom to make sure that normal connections from inside the MOD couldn't look at our web pages. I mean, the result is that those senior people who complain about material that is on WikiLeaks are no longer in a position to complain because they can't read it. It's great. And no investigations because they can't see the material that's there. We discovered this using a proactive FOI that we routinely do for sort of these sorts of organisations that might be trying to investigate our sources.
Anything similar on the German side like that?
Yes, the BND, the German equivalent of the CIA, their chief Ernst Uller wrote to us demanding the removal of a document exposing corruption in Kosovo, which included information about CIA behaviour in Kosovo.
Did you respond
under the threat that we would be prosecuted under German law.
Did you respond at all?
Yes. Tell me more, Ernst. Tell me more. Precisely what law is it that we are going to be prosecuted under? And eventually BND decided that they didn't want to tell us the law that we would be prosecuted under because, of course, there is no such law.
The line from Islamabad and Washington at the time was the leaks that came out were relevant to since they were 7 months old.
Please speak up a little.
The line from Islamabad and Washington at the time was that saying one of the things they said was that as it was 7 months old, it wasn't a reflection on how they did operations now.
Yeah.
Do you have any evidence or anything that you've received to suggest that may make you believe that?
We won't comment on what we have not yet released. But that said, we can look at what happened in 6 years, because you have a window of 6 years from 2004 to 2010, and we don't see sudden dramatic shifts when there is a change in policy, as an example, by the changes in policy when the Crystal came on board. I would find it very unlikely if there were any sudden dramatic shifts in the behaviour of US forces or the ISI over the last 7 months, given that there hasn't been any significant change in the prior 4 years. It would seem to be unlikely to me.
If there would be any inquiry into them, would you be willing to give the original raw material to get people on inside if there would be a need, or if they would request it from a governmental side?
What do you mean?
Would you open up the material, the raw material which you now have produced basically from the fall?
We have made available to the world 76,000 of these reports in CSV format, XML format, SQL format. As a format, you can load the whole lot into Google Earth and plot it by space and time. We have also released all the reports in a browsable interface. That if we actually get this VGA cable working, I'll be able to show you. That said, of course, we have not released the precise format that we obtained from our source.
I think you have the adapter. Do you have an adapter for that? They reckon you have downstairs.
They reckon I have, do they?
They reckon in your briefcase you've got an adapter. If not, I can go and get it.
Not to my knowledge.
Now we'll